If you play the flute, you very likely played a concerto or a piece by Johann Quantz. So who was Quantz, and why did he write so much music for the flute? To answer that question, we have to go back to Prussia in the early 1700s, when the future Frederick the Great was growing up under a father who believed the purpose of a king was discipline, obedience, and military strength. Frederick's father was Frederick William I, the King of Prussia, and he was known as the Soldier King, which tells you almost everything you need to know about him. He wanted his son to become tough, practical, military, and completely devoted to the Prussian state. Frederick wanted something else. He was drawn to music, books, poetry, French culture, and especially the flute. To his father, this was not just a harmless artistic interest. It was a warning sign that Frederick was becoming soft, refined, and completely wrong for the kind of ruler Prussia needed. But Frederick never gave up the flute. When he became King of Prussia in 1740, he became one of the great military rulers of the 18th century. But he also became one of the most serious royal flute players in European history. That combination sounds strange, but it is exactly what makes the story interesting. Frederick built Prussia into a military powerhouse. He fought wars, expanded territory, and made the Prussian army one of the most feared armies in Europe. At the same time, he practiced the flute seriously, performed in private concerts, and even composed music for the instrument himself. At his palace near Berlin, Frederick held private evening concerts where the soloist was often Frederick himself, and that created a very specific problem. If the king wants to play flute music all the time, someone has to keep writing flute music. And that is where Johann Joachim Quantz comes into the story. Quantz was already one of the leading flute players in Europe, but at Frederick's court he became something much more unusual. He was Frederick's flute teacher, flute maker, court composer, and personal supplier of new music. In 1741, Quantz officially entered Frederick's service, and he stayed there for the rest of his career. Frederick did not just want the occasional piece for flute, he wanted an entire musical world built around the instrument, so Quantz gave him one. He wrote about 300 flute concertos, nearly 200 solo sonatas, more than 40 trio sonatas, and a huge amount of other chamber music. Now that's an enormous amount of music for one instrument, but it makes sense when you understand who he was writing for. His employer was the King of Prussia, and the king wanted new flute music constantly. Frederick's court was also a serious musical environment, not just a royal hobby happening after dinner. C.P.E. Bach worked there, the Groan brothers worked there, and Quantz worked there. These were major musicians, and Frederick's court became one of the most important musical centers of the 18th century. Quantz also wrote one of the most important flute books of the century, called On Playing the Flute, published in 1752. So he was not just writing music for a royal amateur, he was helping define how the flute was played, taught, and understood in the middle of the 18th century. Over time, though, musical taste changed. Quantz's music belonged to the elegant, courtly world between the late Baroque and early classical style, and later audiences became more interested in music that was more dramatic, more public, and more emotionally direct. As composers like Mozart and Beethoven came to dominate the way people thought about classical music, Quantz's reputation gradually narrowed. He never disappeared, but he became a composer mostly known to flutists, early music players, and music historians. But the reason he wrote so much flute music is actually very simple. Johann Joachim Quantz had the most powerful flute student in Europe, Frederick the Great, the King of Prussia, the ruler who helped build one of the strongest armies in Europe, and the man who wanted new flute music all the time.